Hello, my name's Quentin, and this sleeping cat is my cat, Lucy. And we're here today to read to you episode 2 of the book Pip and Kitten and the End of the World, written by David Congreve. Let's make a start, shall we? The fireball was huge, and the accompanying explosion was deafening. But it took place far enough away from Pip and Kitten's house that it only presented itself as a deep rumble and rattling of window panes. It was enough to wake Pip and Kitten with a start, and they both jumped to their feet, wondering what was going to happen next. The windows were still vibrating, so Pip jumped over to the nearest one and looked out to see what was happening. There was nothing visibly wrong, so Pip went into the guest room next door, which looked out on the opposite side of the house. The guest room was bigger and nicer than Pip's bedroom, but it hadn't housed a guest for about 22 years. Technically, Pip wasn't allowed to go in there, but his curiosity at that moment was greater than his fear of getting into trouble. The wide guest room window looked out over playing fields, and because the house was at the top of a small hill, Pip could see for miles. Sure enough, way off on the horizon was the source of the noise and rattling, a large plume of dark smoke and a dim flickering yellow of flames. Something's exploded, Pip said, being too young to know that stating the obvious was something that was only allowed by politicians and sports commentators. I hope no one's hurt. But Pip, still unaware that he was the last human being alive, had no comprehension of what was happening or why. From his perspective, it merely appeared that something bad had taken place and that people might be in danger. He tried to tell himself that someone else would contact the emergency services to report what he assumed to be a terrible disaster, but his overly sensitive conscience couldn't make peace with that expectation. Pip knew that if he did nothing, he wouldn't sleep tonight, worrying that people might have died because he saw a terrible accident and did nothing to help. There was no option but to call 999, even if there was nothing he could tell them, apart from the fact that something had exploded a long way from his house. But lacking useful information and experience calling the police wasn't what gave Pip pause. His hesitation was because the only working telephone in the house was situated in his aunt's bedroom. Of all the laws laid down by his aunt, both trivial and significant, the most inviolable was that he was never to go into her room at any time for any reason. In fact, even doing what he was doing now, knocking gently on the door, was strictly prohibited in case he interrupted his aunt doing literally anything. Pip knocked 3 separate times on his aunt's bedroom door, each imperceptibly but slightly louder than the last. Kitten sat behind Pip, watching him impatiently. Pip had no way of knowing that Aunt Cribbage was vapour that was diffusing so rapidly, parts of her were already bouncing off the window of a little supermarket in Sheffield. But it still frustrated her sometimes that Pip only had 5 of a cat's 9 senses. Eventually, Kitten could stand his timidity no longer. She pushed past Pip, lifted her front paws onto the bedroom door, and began noisily sharpening her claws, gouging long, deep channels in the soft wooden panelling. "Kitten!" Pip hissed. "Stop that!" He nudged Kitten gently with his foot, and she reluctantly yielded. Pip ran his fingers along the grooves that had been left behind. "What were you thinking? She'll know this was you." Kitten rolled onto her back and stretched to indicate she didn't give a single whisker's worth of damns. "I don't think she's home," Pip finally realised. He tugged the handle down and slowly pushed the door open. This cautious approach to entering his aunt's bedroom might give the impression this was the first time Pip had ever entered her sanctum. But he actually snuck in every time she went to bingo. She never returned before 9, except for the time she got in a drunken fistfight over an alleged dry roasted peanut theft, and returned home with a broken nose that fortunately left her too dizzy to notice Pip dashing away from the vicinity of her room. So he always used those occasions to sneak some time in front of the only television in the house. Aunt Cribbage, may she rest in pieces, generally went to bingo on an evening, which meant it was rare that Pip was able to watch programming designed for children of his age group. But as a result, he developed a keen interest in nature and cookery programs. He tried watching soap operas, but he found it confusing and irritating that everyone was so miserable, especially when everyone's lives seemed considerably less chaotic and violent than his own. Pip had become pretty good at sneaking into his aunt's room, using the television remote control for a couple of hours, and then returning it to precisely the same location, so she would never know he'd broken the rules. If it strikes you as strange that Pip would so willingly and frequently disobey his aunt's edicts, this is quite understandable. All things being equal, Pip would never deliberately misbehave. But he'd learned from a young age that his efforts not to break the rules made no difference to the frequency with which his aunt would dole out corporal punishment. Even sitting quietly in his room and reading for 15 hours a day, an experiment he attempted last year for 26 consecutive days, led to a manic slippering, because he was, Aunt Cribbage said, acting secretively. If obeying the rules or breaking the rules made no odds, Pip concluded that he might as well do what he could get away with if it made his life a little less unbearable. A few hours of television a couple of times a week was a small reward for his disobedience and the inherent risks, but it was better than nothing. Pip was only more cautious on this occasion because he hadn't actually witnessed his aunt leaving the house, and he still had some worry that she might be sleeping on the bed. The door creaked as it opened, making Pip flinch. But when his aunt didn't come flying toward him, he pushed a little more and peeked into the room. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkness because the curtains were closed. It took another moment before Pip was satisfied that his aunt was not present. At least, not anymore. The room was so untidy and strewn with unwashed clothes and bedding, he failed to notice the small pile of clothes next to the bed, which represented the final resting spot of Aunt Cribbage. When her flesh and bones disintegrated, in less than a nanosecond, her garments simply fell to the floor where she had been standing. A floral, voluminous dress lay bunched up on a rug, nestled around the oversized bra and knickers that had historically attempted, and failed, to contain her wobbly bits. The relief that their ordeal of the last few years was over was almost palpable. Kitten sniffed around the area eagerly, pleased to confirm what she had already sensed, that Aunt Cribbage was gone for good, although a little mournful that she had been denied the fleshy meal she had been patiently awaiting. If Pip had been aware of what had taken place in his aunt's room only a few short hours ago, he would have been horrified. As it was, it would be a couple of weeks before the full import of the situation became apparent. Pip risked turning on the light switch so he could find his way without disturbing any of the room's contents. The telephone he was hunting for was on the far side of the bed. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, because Aunt Cribbage had no friends who called, and she hadn't used the phone since last year, when she'd pretended to call the social services to have Pip taken away and adopted by a family of cannibals. Pip, of course, wasn't fooled. He had overtaken Aunt Cribbage's feeble intelligence by the age of 6, but he pretended to be devastated with the hopes of avoiding any further abuse. At least for that day. Using the sleeve of his jumper, Pip wiped the dust from the surface of the phone and picked up the receiver. He dialed 999 and waited anxiously to see what would happen next. And that was the end of episode 2 of Pip and Kitten and the End of the World, written by David Congreve. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe so you don't miss episode 3 of Pip and Kitten and the End of the World. If you'd like to know more, please visit pipandkitten.com. Also, if you'd like to own your own copy of the book, please visit Amazon and search for Pip and Kitten and the End of the World. There you'll be able to buy a book just like this, or download a digital copy for your Kindle or other device. If she was awake, Lucy and I would like to thank you for watching and tell you that we will be back soon with episode 3 of Pip and Kitten and the End of the World. Until then, goodbye.